October 3rd, 1944. Peleliu's coral dust hung in the air like smoke as Private First Class Daniel Mercer crouched behind a wall of sandbags, his face streaked with sweat, grime, and island mud. The Japanese rifle fire snapping overhead felt close enough to touch. Mercer pressed his back against the rough burlap, breathing through clenched teeth, clutching something the rest of the platoon had spent 2 days laughing at, a wooden breastplate he had carved from supply crate planks. It wasn't standard issue. It wasn't in any manual. And according to everyone around him, it was the dumbest idea on the island. Around the trench, the chaos was tightening like a vice. A Browning machine gun rattled somewhere behind him. A corporal shouted coordinates the way a drowning man shouts for air. Dirt rained from the sandbags every time a Japanese round cracked into them. Men ducked, cursed, scrambled for cover. Mercer just kept pressing that square panel of wood tighter against his chest, as if willing it to matter. The Marine Corps had rules: clean, printed, rehearsed rules. Flak jacket, M1 helmet, keep low, trust the gear. But the manuals didn't account for what the platoon had been dealing with for 3 weeks. Ricochet fire bouncing unpredictably through trenches, sniper rounds coming in at low angles, fragments slicing sideways through cover. Mercer had watched 2 friends get hit by rounds that skipped off rocks or roots before any man even saw the enemy. That was the problem nobody wrote down. That was the gap the wooden armor tried to fill, and the reason they mocked him for it. "Hey, carpenter boy," one Marine had jeered that morning. "You building a fort or fighting a war?" Another laughed, slapping the wooden plate. "Hope the termites don't get you before the Japanese do." Mercer didn't answer. He'd been a furniture maker before the war. He understood wood, how it flexed, how it absorbed impact, how grain patterns could redirect force. Maybe it wouldn't stop a bullet, maybe it would splinter. But if it slowed around by even a fraction, maybe it meant one thing that mattered: going home alive. A crack echoed from the ridge. Mercer felt not heard, a thud slam into his chest. His back struck the sandbags. Breath blasted out of his lungs. For one frozen moment, he thought he was dead. Then he looked down. The plank across his chest was split into a burst pattern, jagged, star-shaped fractures radiating from a single impact. No blood, no hole, just torn wood and the trembling knowledge that a Japanese round had hit him squarely and hadn't gone through. Around him, the trench fell silent. The stupid wooden armor had just saved his life, and the platoon would never look at that board or at Mercer the same way again. The coral air of Peleliu clung to every surface, drifting across the sandbag walls as Mercer steadied his breathing and tried to understand how he was still alive. The trench stretched only a few yards in each direction, its narrow shape forcing the Marines to crouch shoulder to shoulder, while the distant echo of Japanese rifles rolled across the ridge like low thunder. The morning haze had begun to lift, revealing jagged coral outcrops and shattered palm trunks that looked like broken spears jutting from the earth. Mercer pressed his fingertips against the splintered wooden plate, feeling the rough grain and the warm vibration left behind by the impact. The board smelled faintly of salt, sweat, and sun-baked pine, carrying the memory of the supply crates it had once been before he carved them into something entirely different. A thin gust of wind pushed dust into the trench, coating the men's uniforms in a fine gray powder that mingled with the grime already ground into their faces. To Mercer's left, Sergeant Howell scanned the ridge through narrowed eyes, his jaw locked in concentration as he tried to judge the distance of the next incoming volley. His voice, roughened by weeks of shouting over gunfire, carried a tense authority that forced everyone to stay focused despite the chaos clawing at their nerves. He glanced toward Mercer with disbelief still etched across his features, unable to reconcile the ridiculous wooden armor they had mocked with the fact that it had just absorbed a lethal round. Further down the trench, Corporal Medina adjusted the feed belt of his Browning machine gun, cursing under his breath as he wiped sweat from his brow with a dirt-stained sleeve. Medina's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the exhaustion that came from fighting in an oven of coral dust, humidity, and relentless enemy pressure. The metallic clink of the Browning's receiver echoed through the trench, blending with the soft shuffle of boots and equipment scraping against burlap bags. Above the trench lip, the landscape seemed frozen in a tense stillness, broken only by the occasional crack of a rifle or the thud of a distant mortar round. The Japanese positions were invisible behind the jagged ridge, but everyone felt their presence, the quiet, patient watchfulness of an enemy waiting for the next opportunity to strike. A faint smell of spent gunpowder drifted on the breeze, mixing with the earthy scent of damp soil and the sweet rot of fallen palm fronds. Mercer forced himself to peer over the sandbags, lifting only enough to see the terrain without exposing his head. The ridge glowed pale under the rising sun, its rough coral gleaming like fractured bone. Somewhere beyond that ridge, the sniper who had taken the shot was adjusting his sights, perhaps wondering why his target was still upright. Mercer ducked back down, feeling the hammering of his heart begin to steady as adrenaline gave way to the weight of what had just happened. The men around him exchanged cautious glances, silently acknowledging that something unexplainable had occurred, something that didn't fit the rigid rules of warfare they had been taught. Mercer felt their attention linger on him longer than usual, not with ridicule but with a kind of wary curiosity that none of them had expected to feel. The wooden armor lay across his lap, cracked and splintered, yet undeniably proof that improvisation could matter as much as doctrine on a battlefield built from coral and fire. As the sun climbed higher, its harsh light spilled across the trench and illuminated the dust suspended in the air, turning each floating particle into a tiny spark. The day's fight had only begun, and every man knew the worst was still ahead, but Mercer now carried something the others lacked, an understanding that survival sometimes came from the simplest, most unlikely ideas. The battlefield might have been unforgiving, but in that narrow strip of earth, the rules of war had just been rewritten by a plank of pine. The fragile calm inside the trench shattered as a sudden burst of Japanese fire tore across the ridge, sending chips of coral spraying through the air and forcing every Marine to flatten themselves against the sandbags with desperate instinct. Sergeant Howell barked rapid orders that blended with the crack of incoming rounds, his voice straining to rise above the growing cacophony of metal striking sand, men scrambling for cover, and equipment clattering against the trench floor. The tight confines of the position amplified every sound until it felt as though the entire world had narrowed to a tunnel of noise, dust, and pulsing fear. Corporal Medina yanked the Browning's receiver open and fed another belt through trembling fingers, muttering sharp curses as fragments of coral stung his face and neck. His machine gun position, wedged awkwardly between two collapsed sections of the trench, left him barely enough room to swivel the heavy weapon without bumping into the men crouched beside him. Each adjustment sent a scraping echo down the narrow fortification, underscoring just how cramped and vulnerable their defensive line had become during the morning's escalating firefight. Nearby, Private O'Rourke clutched his helmet with one hand, while fumbling for his ammunition pouch with the other, his breathing growing louder as panic threatened to overwhelm his focus. He hissed that the Japanese were repositioning along the ridge, insisting he could hear them moving through the brush, though the others could only hear the relentless crack of rifles and the dull thump of distant mortars. His anxiety bled into the atmosphere, tightening the already claustrophobic energy that hung over the trench like a suffocating weight. Mercer felt the chaos press against him from all sides, squeezing his ribs and filling his lungs with dusty, humid air as he tried to keep his thoughts anchored to anything resembling calm. The splintered wooden armor across his lap reminded him he was still alive, yet survival felt increasingly fragile as each new salvo brought dirt cascading down from the sandbags and sent vibrations through the ground beneath his boots. He could hear the subtle rasp of fear in the voices around him, even in those trying their hardest to sound composed. A mortar round landed somewhere behind their line, shaking the trench like a sudden quake and showering the Marines with loose debris that peppered their shoulders and helmets. Howell shouted for everyone to stay low and conserve ammunition, though his words were nearly drowned out by Medina's machine gun roaring to life in a long, desperate burst aimed toward the ridge's shadowed edge. The weapon's recoil shook Medina's entire frame, but he kept firing, teeth clenched, as if the barrage alone could hold back the unseen enemy pressing steadily closer. The air grew hotter as gunfire intensified, mixing the acrid smell of gunpowder with the sour scent of sweat-soaked uniforms and the earthy odor of torn sandbags spilling their contents into the trench. Every Marine felt the pressure mounting, the claustrophobic trench turning into both shield and prison as they fought to track movements they could barely see through the drifting haze. The uncertainty gnawed at them, creating a grinding tension that made even the most seasoned men grit their teeth in frustration. Mercer wiped dust from his eyes and forced himself to meet Howell's gaze, seeing a flicker of recognition there, an unspoken acknowledgement that the next minutes could decide everything. The sergeant's face was streaked with grime, yet his expression carried a hardened resolve that steadied the entire trench more effectively than any shouted command. Around them, the Marines pressed their bodies closer to the sandbags, preparing for whatever came next, driven by the chaotic rhythm of survival, echoing through every cramped inch of their fragile defensive line. The battlefield beyond the trench roared with unpredictable violence, but inside this narrow corridor of earth and sand, the men clung to discipline, instinct, and each other, knowing the chaos swirling around them would only grow worse before any chance of relief arrived. The pressure from all sides welded them together in a single pulsing heartbeat of fear, grit, and determination, and Mercer felt the weight of that bond as surely as he felt the splintered wood pressed against his chest. The chaos pressing down on the trench reminded Mercer of everything the Marine Corps manuals insisted should keep men alive, even though those polished rules often felt painfully disconnected from the brutal reality unfolding across Peleliu's coral ridges. The training books had preached clarity and confidence, claiming that proper posture, steady breathing, and precise equipment use would allow a Marine to withstand nearly any battlefield surprise. Yet nothing in those neat diagrams mentioned ricocheting bullets skipping unpredictably through dense jungle foliage, or the way coral fragments could turn a single near miss into a spray of razor-sharp debris. During boot camp, Mercer remembered instructors emphasizing the importance of relying on issued gear, reminding recruits that the M1 helmet and standard flak vest were carefully engineered to provide optimal protection against shrapnel and indirect fire. They spoke with absolute certainty, using words like proven, tested, and battle-ready, as if those claims alone could shield a man from the relentless chaos that now echoed through the trench walls. The manual's illustrations showed confident Marines standing tall behind sandbags, their equipment arranged in perfect balance, completely detached from the dirty, suffocating conditions Mercer now faced. Instructors had also warned against altering or supplementing protective gear, insisting that any deviation from regulation equipment could compromise safety and disrupt the uniformity critical to Marine discipline. Mercer could still hear their stern voices stressing that unauthorized modifications, no matter how small, would result in disciplinary action because the Corps valued consistency over improvisation. The rules had been drilled into them so thoroughly that survival seemed to depend less on instinct and more on strict adherence to the established procedures. But as the battle dragged on, those perfect procedures felt increasingly hollow, especially when men were struck by fragments that curved strangely through the air, or bullets that bounced off coral outcrops and entered trenches from impossible angles. Mercer had watched well-equipped Marines fall beside him despite doing everything precisely as the manual instructed, and each loss carved deeper doubts into the unquestioning faith he once held in those standardized systems. The rigid rules had never accounted for Peleliu's complex terrain, or the cunning adaptability of the Japanese marksmen concealed along the ridge. Manuals claimed that sandbag walls and proper spacing along the trench line would mitigate exposure, yet the cramped layout of their defensive position forced the unit to huddle so closely that any incoming fire threatened multiple men at once. The guides recommended rotating firing positions to maintain awareness, but the jagged coral and collapsing earth frequently made movement more dangerous than holding still. Even the prescribed method for advancing or retreating became nearly impossible in the tight, uneven space that offered little more than a crouch-high corridor. Mercer thought back to the carefully illustrated page describing expected bullet trajectories, showing simple straight lines that bore no resemblance to the chaotic arcs he had witnessed firsthand. The Japanese rifles, firing from elevated angles or through foliage, sent rounds skipping unpredictably, transforming the battlefield into a violent geometry entirely absent from the doctrine he had been taught. He had begun to realize that survival depended less on memorizing those diagrams and more on adapting quickly to the realities carved into the coral landscape around him. As another round snapped overhead and shattered a palm stump behind the trench, Mercer tightened his grip on the cracked wooden armor resting across his knees, feeling its rough surface press reassuringly against his palms. The manual might have dismissed such improvised solutions as foolish or unsafe, but the truth burning through Mercer's thoughts was far more immediate and undeniable. The standard procedures had not stopped the bullet that nearly killed him, but a plank of pine ripped from a supply crate had succeeded where regulation gear had failed. As Mercer studied the splintered wooden plate resting across his lap, he felt a growing conviction that the manuals had overlooked something fundamental about the battlefield, something far more dangerous than any straightforward exchange of rifle fire. The island's jagged coral surface distorted bullets in unpredictable ways, sending rounds tumbling or ricocheting into trenches at angles no training diagram had ever attempted to model. Even well-positioned Marines who followed every regulation to the letter had been struck by fragments that behaved like angry insects, darting erratically through the air before embedding themselves in flesh. He remembered watching a fellow rifleman collapse after a round skipped wildly off a rock and curved downward into the trench, punching through the man's shoulder despite the protective stance instructors had insisted would minimize exposure. That moment had haunted Mercer for days, because it revealed a terrifying truth. The battlefield ignored doctrine entirely and crafted its own set of rules that punished soldiers who relied too rigidly on prescribed techniques. Fear had begun to settle into the unit, not because they doubted their training, but because they realized the island refused to play by the logic those lessons had promised. The Japanese marksmen exploited every contour of the terrain, using twisted tree trunks, coral ridges, and deep shadows to create firing positions that bent trajectories in ways the Marines were never taught to anticipate. Every shot seemed to arrive from a slightly different angle, bouncing through the environment before reaching its target with enough retained force to maim or kill. The enemy understood Peleliu far better than the manuals had accounted for, and their rounds behaved more like rebounding shards of metal guided by the island's topography than simple straight-line projectiles. Even the flak vest, which was meant to protect against fragmentation, struggled to counter the uniquely violent behavior of ricochets that accelerated rather than slowed after striking coral. Several Marines had been hit by fragments traveling at bizarre vectors, entering soft gaps between vest panels or slipping beneath the edge of the standard-issue M1 helmet. Mercer realized that the Corps had designed its protection for conventional battlefields, not hostile landscapes that twisted physics into cruel and unpredictable patterns. As these fragmented memories replayed in his mind, he understood why the wooden armor had felt like a necessary gamble rather than a foolish experiment. Wood had properties the manuals never acknowledged. It absorbed and dispersed impact differently than metal, offering a more forgiving surface against rounds that had already deformed or tumbled in mid-flight. While a direct hit from a fully stable bullet would likely pierce it, the majority of projectiles that reached their trench had lost some measure of stability, making them vulnerable to the subtle cushioning effects of layered planks. He remembered running his hand along the grain while carving the armor, feeling the natural fibers align in ways that distributed pressure across broader surfaces. It struck him then that the very weakness the others mocked the material's softness was precisely what allowed it to capture unstable rounds rather than shatter under them. The crate wood, though crude, offered a flexible shield against the chaotic physics of ricochets that consistently bypassed regulation gear designed for more traditional threats. Another burst of rifle fire skimmed over the trench, rattling the sandbags and pulling Mercer from his thoughts. But the realization continued to strengthen inside him. The manuals had failed because they assumed order where none existed, while his crude wooden armor had succeeded because it acknowledged the battlefield's inherent unpredictability. In a place where bullets refused to travel in straight lines and danger arrived from impossible directions, improvisation was not recklessness. It was survival shaped by the island's unforgiving truth. Mercer traced the fractured lines across the wooden plate and felt a strange mixture of vindication and exhaustion settle into his bones, reminding him of the long path that had led him to build something so unorthodox in the first place. Before the war, he had spent years in a small workshop in Oregon, shaping timber into tables, bed frames, and cabinets with the quiet patience of someone who understood the subtle language of grain patterns and pressure. Wood had been his world, a material that bent under the right hands, yet resisted with quiet stubbornness when mistreated, and those instincts had followed him into the Marine Corps even when he tried to bury them beneath regulation discipline. During training, his fellow recruits had teased him gently about his background, joking that he would probably carve a rocking chair in the middle of a firefight or whittle spoons during night watch. The jokes had seemed harmless then, part of the camaraderie that bonded new Marines together, yet the tone shifted once they landed on Peleliu, and realized Mercer's woodworking skills did not fit neatly into the rigid expectations of frontline combat. While other men earned reputations for marksmanship or brute endurance, Mercer became known as Carpenter Boy, a nickname delivered with a smirk that implied he was slightly out of place among hardened riflemen. Even before he built the wooden armor, the platoon treated him with a mixture of amusement and mild frustration, especially when his methods differed from standard procedure in small but noticeable ways. He preferred reinforcing foxholes with scavenged planks rather than relying solely on sandbags, and he often secured gear using improvised wooden braces when issued straps failed under strain. These habits, harmless in isolation, became fodder for constant ribbing that grew sharper as the days passed and the pressure of combat mounted around them. Yet Mercer rarely defended himself, choosing instead to focus on solving problems the only way he knew how, by applying the steady, deliberate logic of a craftsman rather than the rigid formulas of a soldier trained strictly by the book. This quiet determination made him an outsider within the unit, a man whose strengths were invisible until the battlefield created situations where improvisation mattered more than protocol. To the others, he seemed slow or overly cautious, but Mercer simply preferred thinking carefully before acting, knowing instinctively that rushed decisions often led to broken wood and, on Peleliu, broken men. When he first carried the crude wooden plate into the trench, the laughter came swiftly and loudly, echoing across the sandbags with the same mocking rhythm that had accompanied so many of his earlier attempts at battlefield ingenuity. Medina had doubled over laughing, claiming Mercer looked like a medieval farmer preparing to chase wolves from his livestock, while O'Rourke suggested the Japanese would shoot him out of pity rather than hostility. Even Sergeant Howell, usually measured in his judgments, shook his head with a mixture of disbelief and faint irritation, insisting that the contraption would slow him down and probably splinter dangerously on impact. Despite the ridicule, Mercer had remained steady, fastening the straps with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted his hands more than other people's opinions. He knew wood better than anyone in the platoon, and he understood that even a crude shield could redirect force in ways metal sometimes could not, especially against destabilized rounds distorted by coral and foliage. The mockery rolled off him like sawdust, brushed from an old workbench, leaving behind only the drive to prove, if only to himself, that his instincts still had value in a world built from fire and chaos. When the bullet struck earlier that morning, Mercer had felt not pride but a heavy, sobering clarity that cut deeper than any ridicule he had endured. The same men who had laughed now stared at him with a mixture of astonishment and unease, their expressions revealing an unspoken truth that none dared voice aloud. The man they had mocked for being different had survived because of the very difference they dismissed, and the battlefield had delivered its verdict with brutal precision. Mercer remembered the night he finally decided to build the wooden armor, a night when exhaustion, frustration, and a growing sense of helplessness converged into a single, defiant impulse that pushed him far beyond the boundaries of Marine Corps protocol. The platoon had just endured another day of chaotic ricochet fire, and 2 men were evacuated with wounds caused by bullets that seemed to bend unnaturally through the coral landscape, leaving everyone uneasy and increasingly skeptical of the standard gear meant to protect them. As dusk settled over the island and the humid air thickened around the dimly lit supply area, Mercer found himself staring at a stack of discarded ammunition crates, their rough pine boards glowing faintly under the lantern light. He approached the crates almost unconsciously, driven by a quiet compulsion that felt less like rebellion and more like instinctive problem-solving, the kind he had practiced countless times in his workshop back home. With a quick glance to ensure the area was empty, he pried open the crate lids using a combat knife, letting the metallic scrape fade into the night's steady chorus of insects and distant artillery. Each plank came free with a sharp crack, releasing a familiar scent of resin and sun-dried wood that stirred memories of calmer days spent shaping furniture rather than fighting for survival. The decision to continue felt strangely natural, as if his hands already understood what his mind struggled to articulate, and he began sorting the boards by grain direction and thickness, with the practiced precision of a craftsman. He selected 2 wide planks for the primary surface, trimming the edges carefully with his knife to remove splinters and create a gentle curve capable of dispersing impact across a broader section of his chest. Working quickly but methodically, he layered thinner slats along the interior, cross-bracing them at strategic angles to create a crude but resilient structure that mimicked the laminated techniques he had once used for chair backs and cabinet doors. To secure the planks, Mercer scavenged strips of leather from a damaged pack, softening them with water before threading them through drilled holes he created with the red-hot tip of a heated bayonet. Each strap was pulled tight with a determined tug, binding the plates together with a strength that surprised even him as the crude armor began taking shape in his lap. He tested the flexibility by pressing inward with both palms, feeling the wood flex slightly without cracking, confirming his belief that its natural give would serve better against unstable rounds than the rigid metal of regulation gear. The more the armor took form, the more acutely he felt the weight of what he was doing, fully aware that any officer discovering his midnight project would likely reprimand him for altering equipment without authorization. Yet the fear of punishment seemed insignificant compared to the fear of waking up tomorrow to another ricochet cutting through the trench and finding his chest unprotected. With every notch carved into the wood and every strap tightened across its surface, Mercer embraced a quiet defiance that rejected blind adherence to doctrine in favor of a solution grounded in practical experience and personal necessity. Once finished, he held the armor up to the lantern, examining the rough but sturdy contours with a mixture of apprehension and quiet pride, recognizing that this piece of improvised craftsmanship carried the same careful thought he once devoted to building furniture for families rather than tools for survival. Slipping the straps around his shoulders, he felt the weight settle evenly across his torso, lighter than he expected yet reassuringly solid, like a familiar companion forged from the remnants of a life that war had nearly erased. The armor fit awkwardly under his uniform, but not enough to impede movement, and he adjusted the straps until the wooden plates sat firmly against his chest. As he extinguished the lantern and stepped back into the darkness, Mercer understood that he had crossed an invisible line between obedience and ingenuity, committing fully to a path the others would almost certainly ridicule in the morning. Yet, he carried no regret, only a steady resolve shaped by the belief that the battlefield rewarded adaptation over conformity, even when that adaptation came wrapped in pine and bound with makeshift leather straps. The rule was broken, the armor was built, and whatever judgment awaited him would matter far less than the chance, however slim, that this unorthodox creation might keep him alive for one more day on Peleliu's unforgiving ground. When Mercer first stepped into the trench wearing the wooden armor, the reaction from the platoon was immediate and unmistakably loud, erupting in a mixture of laughter, disbelief, and the kind of sarcastic commentary that only exhausted soldiers could deliver with such sharp precision. Medina caught sight of the planks peeking beneath Mercer's web gear and nearly dropped the belt he was carrying, doubling over as he shouted to the others that someone had apparently brought a barn door into combat. O'Rourke chimed in with equal enthusiasm, joking that the Japanese snipers would surely take pity on a man foolish enough to protect himself with leftover packing crates. Even Sergeant Howell, normally composed and deliberate with his assessments, couldn't resist a brief smirk that betrayed his skepticism, though he attempted to mask it with a half-hearted lecture about the dangers of carrying unauthorized equipment. He warned Mercer that improvised gear could splinter in unpredictable ways or snag on obstacles during movement, potentially turning the wearer into a walking liability rather than an asset. Despite the authoritative tone, Howell's words carried a faint hint of amusement, as if he struggled to maintain seriousness while addressing something so far outside the realm of standard battlefield logic. The other Marines gathered around with the kind of curiosity reserved for absurd spectacles, poking lightly at the wooden panels and tapping the edges with knuckles, as though testing whether the contraption might crumble at any moment. Their laughter bounced off the sandbag walls, filling the narrow trench with a jovial energy that contrasted sharply with the grim tension that had gripped them for days. Someone suggested Mercer should carve a matching helmet to complete the ensemble, while another asked mockingly if he intended to block bullets like a baseball catcher blocking pitches from behind home plate. Mercer endured the ridicule in silence, adjusting the leather straps with calm, methodical movements that reflected no embarrassment despite the attention focused squarely on him. He understood the humor wasn't cruel, but rather a coping mechanism forged under relentless pressure, a way for the men to release fear before the next firefight tightened its grip around their throats. Still, each joke and exaggerated gesture served as a reminder that he had stepped deliberately outside the comfort of conformity, placing himself on an island within the unit long before the enemy ever fired a shot. As the morning sun climbed higher, the jeers grew more creative, with Medina claiming the armor might help Mercer deflect coconuts during storms, and O'Rourke insisting that the contraption looked like something a desperate farmer would wear while driving chickens away from his cornfield. The laughter rolled through the trench in waves, mingling with the distant crack of rifle fire and the subtle rustle of shifting sandbags as Marines repositioned themselves between bouts of teasing. Mercer listened quietly, keeping his expression neutral, though inside he felt a small ember of determination glow brighter with each passing remark. Despite the mockery, he noticed fleeting moments when curiosity overshadowed ridicule, small pauses where the men traced the grain of the wood or examined the layering with genuine interest. These brief lapses suggested that beneath the humor rested a deeper, unspoken question about whether the armor possessed unexpected merit. The battlefield had already demonstrated its disregard for textbook rules, and Mercer suspected that even the most vocal skeptics recognized the possibility, however remote, that unconventional ideas might hold hidden value in such unpredictable conditions. When Howell finally ended the teasing with a curt order to prepare for potential contact, the Marines dispersed reluctantly, their chuckles fading as they resumed their defensive positions along the trench. Mercer adjusted the planks one last time, feeling their weight settle steadily against his chest, anchoring him with a quiet resolve forged not from pride but from the simple hope of surviving another day. The laughter lingered in the air like smoke, but Mercer understood that proving himself did not require changing his comrades' opinions, only surviving long enough for the battlefield to speak on his behalf. The opportunity to test Mercer's improvised armor arrived far sooner than anyone expected, materializing in the form of a sudden, chilling silence that settled over the trench like a warning whispered directly into each man's ear. Moments earlier, the Marines had been trading tired jokes while adjusting their gear, but the abrupt halt of distant rifle fire signaled a shift in the battlefield's rhythm that every seasoned soldier immediately recognized. Howell raised a clenched fist to signal stillness, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the ridge, sensing movement concealed beneath the shifting shadows of the jagged coral outcrops. A faint metallic click echoed from somewhere beyond the tree line, barely audible above the soft rustle of palm fronds, swaying under the heavy morning air. Medina cursed under his breath, his fingers tightening reflexively around the Browning's grips, while O'Rourke muttered that the sound came from a sniper repositioning to secure a better angle on the trench. The rest of the unit huddled lower, pressing their backs against the sandbags, as the oppressive quiet stretched disturbingly long, amplifying even the smallest motions until every heartbeat felt like a drumbeat against their ribs. Mercer felt the wooden armor shift slightly with each controlled breath he took, its curved planks resting firmly against his chest, like a second ribcage forged from pine and raw determination. He tried to steady his thoughts, reminding himself that he had built the contraption to confront exactly this kind of unpredictable threat. Yet as moments passed without a single shot being fired, he sensed the sniper's presence tightening around them like an invisible noose, slowly drawing inward. The tension rose with each passing second, coiling inside the trench until the air felt heavy enough to crush. Then, without warning, a sharp crack sliced through the quiet, carrying the unmistakable pitch of a high-velocity round fired from the ridge's concealed vantage point. The bullet struck the sandbag wall inches from Howell's shoulder, sending a spray of dirt and burlap fibers across the trench, while triggering a cascade of shouted warnings. Medina swung the Browning toward the ridgeline, unleashing a long, ragged burst that churned the coral surface with plumes of pale dust, though no visible target revealed itself in the chaos of retaliatory fire. Before the Browning's echo faded, a second shot rang out cleaner, closer, and far more deliberate its trajectory, carving a path straight through the narrow gap between two leaning palm trunks that framed a natural line of sight into the Marines' defensive position. The round hurtled downward at a shallow angle, striking the exact spot where Mercer crouched while adjusting his rifle sling. The impact slammed into his chest with a dull, resonant thud that drove the air from his lungs and sent him staggering backward into the sandbags behind him. The wooden armor absorbed most of the force, but the collision rattled Mercer's bones so intensely that stars flashed across his vision, reducing the world to a blur of dust, shouts, and flickering sunlight. He gasped sharply, one hand gripping the splintered front plate, while the other braced against the trench wall to steady himself. For a brief, disorienting moment, he wasn't sure whether he had been mortally wounded or merely stunned, but the absence of blood beneath his fingers slowly pulled him back into clarity. The Marines nearest to him froze in disbelief, staring at the fractured armor now marked by a fresh, cratered impact, surrounded by spiderweb cracks radiating across the grain. O'Rourke's expression shifted from morbid curiosity to open-mouthed astonishment, while Medina muttered an incredulous remark, questioning how the hell Mercer was still standing after taking a direct sniper hit. Howell knelt beside him with uncharacteristic urgency, inspecting the cracked plate as though trying to piece together the impossible physics that had just unfolded within their cramped trench. As Mercer's breath finally steadied, he realized the shot had been aimed with lethal intent, traveling along a perfect line designed to punch straight into his chest had the armor not intervened. The wooden plate, mocked, dismissed, and ridiculed hours earlier, had performed its first true test under conditions no one could deny. It had held, and Mercer was alive not because of luck, but because his unorthodox craft had defied a sniper's precision through nothing more than layered pine and sheer resolve. In the stunned silence that followed, the battlefield seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the significance of the moment, long before any man dared to speak it aloud. The stunned silence hanging over the trench deepened as Mercer finally managed to lift the shattered wooden plate from his chest, revealing a sprawling burst pattern that radiated outward like the veins of a lightning strike frozen in grain. Every Marine within arm's reach leaned closer, drawn by the irresistible pull of disbelief that compelled them to witness the undeniable evidence etched into the cracked pine. The bullet's impact had left a deep crater at the center, crushing fibers inward and splintering the surrounding layers in jagged, irregular lines that testified to the incredible force absorbed by the improvised armor. Howell reached out with cautious fingers, tracing the fractured grooves as though attempting to decipher some hidden message carved into the wood by the violence of the strike. His expression, usually controlled and steady, shifted between shock, relief, and an almost scientific curiosity, as if he were struggling to reconcile everything he thought he knew with the proof resting in Mercer's trembling hands. He muttered that the round must have destabilized or ricocheted before hitting, though even that explanation failed to account for the sheer volume of force the armor had managed to dissipate. Medina stepped closer and whistled softly, shaking his head as he pointed out how the layered planks had bent instead of shattering completely, suggesting the wood's natural flexibility had played a crucial role in dispersing the energy. His voice carried none of the earlier mockery. Instead, it held a quiet reverence for the unlikely craftsmanship that had saved Mercer's life, with a material most men associated only with campfires or makeshift furniture. O'Rourke, who had been the loudest critic of the idea, stared at the cracked armor with an expression caught somewhere between amazement and embarrassment, unable to reconcile his earlier jokes with the life-preserving reality before him. As the men examined the armor, Mercer felt the lingering tremor in his limbs ease slightly, replaced by a deep, grounding awareness of how close he had come to dying only moments earlier. The weight of that realization pressed against his ribs with far greater force than the bullet itself, anchoring him in a moment that balanced precariously between gratitude and dread. Every breath he drew seemed sharper, as if the air itself carried the memory of the near-fatal impact that still reverberated faintly within his bones. When Howell finally rose to his full height, he addressed the entire trench with a tone that carried no humor, stating plainly that Mercer should have been killed by that shot, and that nothing short of the armor's intervention could explain why he remained standing. The other Marines exchanged glances heavy with unspoken acknowledgement, each silently accepting the truth that the battlefield had just validated Mercer's defiance in the most decisive way imaginable. What had once been dismissed as a foolish contraption now felt like a miraculous shield shaped by instinct, necessity, and a carpenter's understanding of how wood bends under pressure. Mercer clutched the damaged armor against his chest, feeling the uneven tears in the surface as though they formed a map of the moment his life had been returned to him against all reasonable odds. The sight of the shattered planks stirred a mixture of pride and humility within him, knowing the crude creation had not been meant as a challenge to the core, but simply as a desperate attempt to survive another day. He had trusted his hands, his experience, and his quiet understanding of materials that most men overlooked, and that trust had paid a price more valuable than any regulation-approved equipment could offer. As the trench gradually resumed the cautious movements of men preparing for the next exchange of fire, Mercer sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him, a shift born not from admiration but from respect tinged with disbelief. The wooden armor had proven itself in the harshest test imaginable, transforming from a subject of ridicule into a symbol of survival carved from the most ordinary material available. And though the battle still raged across Peleliu's unforgiving landscape, the message delivered by that splintered plank was unmistakable. Sometimes the simplest ideas, shaped by necessity rather than doctrine, carried the greatest power to keep a man alive where no manual could. Word of the wooden armor's success spread through the platoon with remarkable speed, moving from man to man in a series of hushed retellings that carried equal parts disbelief and reluctant admiration. What had begun as a spectacle of laughter transformed almost instantly into a point of tactical curiosity, prompting Marines who had previously mocked Mercer to approach him with cautious questions about how he had built the strange life-saving contraption. The tone of their inquiries shifted noticeably, reflecting a quiet recognition that the battlefield had forced them to reconsider ideas they once dismissed with absolute certainty. Medina was the first to ask whether Mercer could help reinforce the firing step near the Browning, suggesting that wooden braces might prevent collapse during heavy recoil. His request lacked any hint of sarcasm, and when Mercer nodded, several other Marines drifted closer, eager to observe the process or offer scraps of wood scavenged from broken crates. Even O'Rourke, who had delivered some of the harshest jokes earlier, asked if Mercer could show him how to cut curved paneling that might offer limited protection to his flank when repositioning along the trench. As Mercer demonstrated how grain direction affected strength, the mood in the trench began to evolve into something almost collaborative, replacing mockery with a shared desire to adapt quickly to the island's unpredictable dangers. Howell watched from a distance at first, arms crossed and expression unreadable, but eventually stepped forward to quietly request a reinforced breastplate for one of the younger Marines who had been rattled by recent near misses. His voice carried a measured respect, acknowledging the practical value of Mercer's craftsmanship without undermining military discipline. Within hours, small clusters of Marines had gathered around improvised workstations fashioned from overturned ammo crates, studying Mercer's techniques as he worked with steady precision despite the ever-present threat of renewed sniper fire. They trimmed planks, sanded edges, and fastened straps, using whatever salvage materials they could find, transforming the trench into a strange combination of defensive fortification and workshop. The rhythm of their activity offered an unusual moment of calm amid the chaos, providing a brief but meaningful distraction from the relentless pressure imposed by the battlefield surrounding them. The chatter grew steadily more focused, with men comparing the effectiveness of different wood thicknesses or debating whether angled panels might deflect stray rounds more efficiently than flat surfaces. Though none expected the improvised armor to withstand a direct hit from a stable bullet, they recognized its potential value against the unstable ricochets that had plagued their position with alarming consistency. The tone of the conversation shifted from tentative interest to practical enthusiasm, illustrating how quickly necessity could transform skepticism into resourcefulness when survival hinged on adaptation. At one point, Howell inspected a finished piece of armor crafted for a nervous private, testing the straps and pressing firmly against the layered planks to evaluate their resilience. His nod of approval carried weight within the platoon, signaling that the improvised gear had earned at least provisional acceptance within the unit's defensive strategy. For many of the Marines, seeing the sergeant acknowledge Mercer's creation served as a subtle validation that ingenuity was not merely tolerated but potentially essential in such an unpredictable environment. As the afternoon sun dipped behind the coral ridge, casting long shadows across the trench, Mercer realized the atmosphere around him had transformed entirely from the morning's ridicule. The men no longer viewed the wooden armor as a bizarre anomaly, but as a potential tool forged by necessity, reflecting the harsh truth that standard doctrine could not anticipate every challenge presented by the battlefield. The shift in attitude felt almost surreal, yet deeply affirming, confirming that survival sometimes depended on embracing unconventional solutions that emerged from the most unlikely origins. By the time the last makeshift armor piece was strapped and tested, the trench had adopted a new sense of unity, grounded in shared adaptation rather than rigid conformity. Mercer felt an unspoken bond forming between the Marines, shaped by the recognition that each man's creativity contributed to the group's overall resilience. The wooden armor, once a subject of ridicule, had become a catalyst for cooperation and a testament to the power of innovation when survival demanded more than adherence to the rules. The chain reaction had begun, and the platoon now moved with a collective awareness shaped by Mercer's defiant ingenuity, an awareness that ingenuity, not doctrine, would keep them alive on Peleliu's unforgiving ground. As dusk settled over the battered ridge and the last echoes of gunfire faded into a distant, irregular murmur, Mercer felt a quiet stillness envelop the trench, carrying with it a sense of reflection that settled deeper than the coral dust clinging to his uniform. The men around him adjusted their makeshift armor one final time, testing straps and tapping the wooden panels with a mixture of cautious optimism and newfound respect, each gesture acknowledging the subtle transformation that had reshaped their outlook on survival. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had grown into a shared symbol of resilience, threaded through the platoon like a cord binding them to a single, unspoken truth about the nature of warfare. Mercer leaned against the sandbags, feeling the weight of exhaustion seep into his limbs while he studied the fractured remains of his original armor, now lying beside him like a relic of a moment that had altered the trajectory of an entire day. The splintered lines across the pine surface seemed almost poetic in their stark brutality, representing not only the chaos of battle, but the fragile line separating life from death on a battlefield where certainty was an illusion. He ran his thumb along the jagged cracks, recognizing that those scars told a story far more honest than any page in a training manual could ever hope to capture. For the first time since arriving on Peleliu, Mercer sensed a shift in his understanding of what it meant to fight in a place that twisted every assumption and challenged every rule he had been taught. The war had revealed itself not as a contest of perfect strategies or flawlessly engineered weapons, but as a harsh and unpredictable test of a man's ability to adapt under circumstances that defied logic. Survival belonged not only to the strongest or most disciplined soldiers, but to those willing to bend, experiment, and trust